Starting this one standing up. So I'm kind of in between stuff right now. Not really. Like, I've already started episode 4. Episode 3 is done, and episode 2, I've actually been letting myself go back and re-render old shots that were, like, technically kind of, like, done, but something about them was bugging me, and so I'm just letting myself be a perfectionist, which is good. Most of the updates, people probably won't even notice. Like, if you saw them next to each other, you'd be like, these are the same. I'm like, yeah, but after watching it, like, 30 times, this thing bugged me. So that feels decadent. I like it. But I thought today it'd be fun to kind of, treat myself to kind of wrapping up my part on that episode by talking about something a little bit more abstract. It's just the creative process and kind of brainstorming, especially in terms of like writing scripts and world building. But I think it's kind of more globally applicable too. And what to do if you have writer's block and how to make sure you keep up momentum on stuff, because like I'm not an expert, but I have been doing it for 20, 30 years, and there's a few things I've kind of learned, different kind of just tricks for keeping stuff going. I kind of thought maybe it isn't a thing that could even be taught. It's just a thing, that either exists in your head that you like doing or, whatever. But I've brainstormed with enough people where it's obvious they haven't done a lot of it, and it's like, oh, there is a little bit of a learning curve to this. It's a headspace that you cultivate. So let's just, I want to kind of do it in terms of a list of just little things I've learned. The first one applies to brainstorming with people who don't brainstorm often. The first thing you think of is probably the most obvious thing. And people don't always realize that. They think of a thing and they go, I did it. I've thought of the thing. And it's like, no, you've thought of literally the most obvious thing. And the next thing you think of will be the second most obvious. And the third will be, and that's not to say the more obscure the idea is, the better it is. And sometimes the first thing you think of is the most obvious because it's the only pure, true, excellent idea. But often I don't use an idea until it's like my 15th idea, because then, usually what happens is you think of just a thing on its own in isolation. That's kind of your first idea of like, why does this? Because of this. But then you start adding in other things like, well, how would this other factor affect it? And by the time you start considering all of these other factors, usually you have something that's more embedded in the world or in the character's, personality or whatever, that's just a little bit more clever and wasn't immediately apparent. Which I guess what I'm trying to say is you can brute force creativity. Just keep thinking of ideas and then wait until there's one that like really appeals to you. But developing that headspace where you're okay kind of half holding an idea in your head and playing around with trying out all of these other ideas is one that can be like a little bit frustrating at first, especially if you kind of think you're getting somewhere. It's hard not to like latch on to that one and still just remember like, no, let's keep playing around and see if there's some other good ideas. I've brainstormed with a few people where they'll come up with something, or we start going down a road. I'm like, let's try this other road, and it's very confusing or frustrating. And it's like, well, we kind of started walking down the road. We have no reason to believe it's the best one. And so kind of there's two states a little bit. There's the work, and then there's the play. And usually the brainstorming is the play, and then there's actually locking things down, figuring out all of like the logistics and the details, and actually making the thing, which is the work. It's kind of, I think of it as like the lateral thinking and like the vertical thinking, or beer and coffee, and that's honestly a lot of what creativity is. It's just the combination, it's the fusion of two different things. Like as you live life, you're seeing and you're experiencing all of this different stuff, and you're putting it in your brain, and then when you put something out, it's this amalgamation of all of this other stuff. And so if you're ever trying to kind of force the creative process and you have an idea that doesn't just work, just start trying to combine it with different stuff. Listen to different genres of music, watch different movies, start reading random things on Wikipedia, and always kind of be thinking like, what if I combine this with my other idea? And eventually you'll kind of like, I think you can usually feel it a little bit. It's like, oh, there's something there, because you start wanting to think about that idea more. In fact, I have sketchbooks everywhere, and I'm always kind of writing in little sketchbooks, and usually like if I'm brainstorming a scene, I'll write down 1 or 2 notes of like things I want to remember, but every once in a while I'll just start going. Like an idea just ignites something, and I'll just fill pages. And even if that's not originally what the scene or whatever was supposed to be about, I make it be about that, because that is where my interest is at. And when it comes to making a personal project, your own interest, your own passion is the only engine that's going to keep it going. Like nobody's going to force you to work on your script or whatever. The thing that's going to keep you awake at night, the thing that's going to make you, be thinking about this stuff as you're sitting on the bus, is your own obsession with a thing. And so I always try to hook any of these big projects up to my obsessions, so the obsessions can drag the entire thing along. Because if it's the idea of just thinking, and I know people who do this, like, oh, I want to be a writer, I want to write a novel, like that's their starting point, and so they go, well, I have to think of a thing to like do a novel about, and so what ends up happening is you start trying to write a novel that expresses the idea of a novel instead of like actually a thing that you want to express. Or like genres are a tricky one, because genres aren't a story, they're not a plot, they're basically a color palette, they're a preset collection of aesthetics and styles that kind of work together, that are understood and known. But I've known people who are like, I'm gonna make a Western, and it's just, like they're talking about the ideas of the gunslinger, or like, a zombie movie, and it's like, what's the plot? Oh, it's, there's infected zombies. What are you talking about? I'm like, that's the genre. You need to figure out what you're actually painting with the colors, not just like, splatting them against the thing. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with not having that core passion that's, that is driving the whole thing. And that's a lot of the trick, is just knowing what the core is that you're passionate about, that you're actually trying to express, and knowing what's like integral to that, and knowing what exists just kind of to help support it. And that other stuff, you got to be really flexible with. A lot of times, the one thing I think I'm good at is not holding on too preciously to ideas. Like, if another idea comes along that's better, I will just drop, even if I've spent, days or months on something, I'll just be like, nope, this other idea is definitely the way to go. And a lot of times, like, it's on set and somebody says something as a joke, and I'm like, that's better. Like, that's more interesting. That because jokes come from that space of play, that lateral space where you're just thinking kind of off the wall. And sometimes it's like, yeah, that is actually just more engaging and unexpected and interesting. Let's go with the joke. And the person's like, well, I was joking. It's like, yeah, no, I know. Let's go. Yeah, there's a lot of things creativity-wise that I'm not great at, but I think that kind of not being precious thing is... Because that's the saying they say, kill your darlings, or you can't be too precious. Because every idea you have, picture your story as like a big loose-knit blanket or like a rubber sheet or something, and you're putting a tack down, you're holding it solid right there. That is a known idea that you want to hold on to. And you get a few of those tacks in, and suddenly the entire thing becomes a lot less flexible. And suddenly, if you want to make a change, it's you can't, because everything's kind of being held down, and so you can only kind of stretch things around on a small scale. And so you want to really keep that flexible. You don't want to... I've known certain people who are trying to write a script, and they have a few of those thumbtacks already in, and they've been stuck on the same script for literally years, because they're like, it has to be able to do this, and this, and they can't come up with a story that does that, and so they just completely freeze up. Whereas, like, if you just take a couple of those thumbtacks out, suddenly the entire thing's a lot more flexible. You can start to actually kind of free yourself up to think again. And you still have that idea. You still have that pin. You can use it elsewhere. You can, like, you're not losing anything. You're just making everything more flexible so you can look at it from a new angle. For me, every scene I'm working on usually takes, when I'm done, like I will have spent a month or two on it. And so if I'm going to spend that long on something, there has to be something about it that gets me excited, even if it's just like a basic dialogue scene. If I were a really good writer, I would just probably hyper focus on writing such incredible dialogue that it could just be, people sitting in a blank room talking at each other, and you're like, oh, this is engaging. And I think I've gotten close a few times, but in general, I'm not that confident with my dialogue, and so I try to kind of like add a few other layers in it, or some other way for it to be interesting. Like in the first episode of Dynamo Dream, there's that point where she's talking to the floorhead, who's just this little severed head in a jar, and he's using his eye to like look at different phonemes, and then there's like a robotic voice that's doing all of the talking based off of those phonemes, and that was completely unnecessary. It could have just been a dude, but like adding this other layer on top of it just kind of makes the whole scene a little bit more like, oh, where's she going? Like, she's in this other world, and it also means it's 50% about what's being said and 50% about the actual mechanism. The same with when she finally makes her phone call, she could have just made a regular phone call, but there's this whole thing where like they launch a missile into the middle of the town, and the missile is speaking with this booming voice, everything that she's saying, which is this kind of like funny layer to add on top of what would otherwise be a fairly regular conversation. It's just kind of it's honestly kind of a cope, I guess, a little bit, and one I hope I won't be too dependent on. But but it's also fun. Although you can always layer stuff, which is cool. If you have two people talking, you can always like recontextualize that in some way, or just have a character doing something interesting. For me, if I just have two characters sitting, like if I'm not thinking about it, I would just have them eating food off of a plate or something like that. But you can make stuff so wacky. What if like during the conversation, one guy's taking the sandwich and he's making a pile out of every single like separate ingredient, like he's making a stack of tomatoes and the pickles and the lettuce, and then he's eating each one individually. Or they might be having a regular conversation, but there's some bombastic parade going on celebrating some cool world building event in the background that's like establishing things, giving the audience stuff to look at, also establishing that this is like normal as far as the characters are concerned, but you also get the information of kind of like whatever they're talking about. It's just and that way, yeah, there's just always something where I'm like, ooh, I get to design a parade or whatever, and that keeps me kind of interested, while still keeping the story moving. Again, I think one of the absolute hardest parts of doing a big, any film is a really hard project, and a lot of times it will take months or years, and so the biggest priority should be keeping yourself working on it, and that means sometimes I'll sacrifice maybe good ideas just for one that I happen to think is kind of interesting. There's another rule that I never assume the audience is going to find something interesting if I don't. And I used to think that I had to write there were certain just necessary scenes that I'd have to write, but I'd kind of dread it. Like especially argument, like two characters, one character's like, well, I want this, and the other one's like, well, I want this. And I'm like, okay, well, it's an argument. And to me, arguments are unless if they've been really well developed, like from character motivation standpoints, they're just kind of like boring. And so I started just being like, wait, I don't have to write that. I can just skip that scene. I can just cut to the aftermath of that. Or I've done a few times where I've just subverted it, where there's this kind of build up to the argument, and then instead one person's just very, very friendly, and it isn't like that. Sounds like, again, I'm kind of like chickening out, but it makes it more interesting because it's something unexpected that's happening, and it usually reveals more about one of the characters' motivations or something than just doing the most obvious thing, which would be, oh, and then they yell at each other like I'm angry or whatever. Actually, usually I've started recognizing that like a lot, that where if there's something that just like I've written myself into a little bit of a corner or whatever, that is a signal for me to try to think about it in a different way, to go back into that fun kind of lateral space and think, okay, well, and literally I'll sometimes do something is just picture the entire scene from a different viewpoint. I'm like, okay, well, I was here, let's step back like 20 miles, and what does this event look like, from this big distance? What does it look like from space? I try different perspectives. I try to see anything to like recontextualize it. I think I've said some of this before, but like, what if they're being spied on by a spy from the other room, and suddenly it isn't their argument, it's the way the spy is perceiving the argument, or just turning into a voiceover where you're juxtaposing it with something that helps express the conversation. I don't need just mixing it up, but I need to get that bit that I'm excited about kind of in there, otherwise I'm like, yeah, I don't know, I've stopped making myself do this stuff. And that's not to say I'm conflict averse. There's some conflict scenes coming up that I'm actually really, really excited to write and film. Just that I'm not going to force the conflict there just because it seems like the thing that should happen, I guess. It's the same with like exposition. I don't want to give the audience information they're not already asking for on some level. I don't want to force them to watch an argument that like hasn't been set up to the point where they're like engaged with how it goes, I guess. Or I mean, a lot of times just on that same vein, jumping between the macro and the micro. Like, the macro is the entire story, the entire world that you're trying to tell, and but the micro is how it's experienced by the characters and the audience. I've been binging on a bunch of World War II documentaries that Netflix has recently, where they colorized all this stuff, and World War II is interesting because I always wanted to know, like, what's the linear story of World War II? And it isn't a linear story. It's a million things happening at once, and like the way they all kind of interplay. But this documentary did a good job of kind of introducing each battle and how the main battles related to the other main battles. But yeah, it's always something like, and then 100,000 people were trying to take this hill, but there's another 20,000 people with tanks that are like, don't take, and it's like, yeah, let's get off that hill. You're all gonna die on that hill. But it's all very abstract, and like that's like the plot. But then they show the footage, and like it's one soldier like, I don't have an arm, and he's screaming or whatever, and you're like, oh wait, that's right. This isn't just swarms of ants. This is thousands of people having the absolute worst day of their life or whatever, or having their proudest moment, or they're watching whatever. Seeing 100,000 people being forced to evacuate a city isn't particularly sad, but watching one person having to deal with, leaving their house again, making it close in human scale, actually is sad. And so bouncing between those two is important, and that's where sometimes if I ever get stuck, jumping back to the macro and making sure that both things are kind of working to support each other is really important. And usually, again, that can be a problem. If you're ever stuck, it's because whatever you're working on isn't actually in support of that big macro global kind of plot. Maybe I'm speaking a little too abstractly here, but I think you get it. I used to think that I wanted to hold off on all these reveals. I had all of these things where I'm like, oh, at some point, I'll drop this bombshell. Like, oh, secretly it's been this thing the entire time. Recontextualize everything. Whoa. But just one, at the speed I actually finish stuff, that means I would never be getting to any of the good bits for decades and decades. And two, I think just putting the interesting stuff at the front means the audience knows the interesting stuff, which means they get to be that much more engaged, and that just is one more dynamic that they get to engage with as all the characters are doing all of these things. It's still fun to have a twist or whatever, but that whole mindset of I want to hold off on revealing the good stuff. I'm front loading quite a bit, and that's made that honestly, the boat shoot. The boat shoot was fairly standard, but there's a few bits that I took that were going to be coming in, 20 episodes down the road, and I was like, what if we just put those in the boat shoot? And that's the absolute best part of the boat shoot. It made the entire thing fun, and it helped motivate the plot. It helped keep everything kind of moving, and it kept me interested and the actors interested. I think it'll make the audience. There's a few things where I think when people are watching the episode, it started to introduce some ideas that the audience will be like, wait, are you kind of going in that kind of direction? It's like, yeah, I think it'll be fun. And also, don't be afraid to get too specific. I feel like so many movies these days, they kind of they don't want to really set up they're trying to go so fast they don't have time to develop any of the roles. It's kind of, they set up a goal, I'm talking mostly blockbuster stuff. They're like, we have to get, the magic orb, and they're like, here we go, and then whatever problems pop up just kind of pop up, and they're like, we have to punch them with our power of friendship or whatever, but they never set up what those obstacles are ahead of time, and that really, anticipation is the agreement that you're making with the audience. That's, the audience wants to come on board, and so you're making promises to them. In exchange, the audience is going, okay, well then I will engage with this. I will be excited for this thing that you've promised in the future. And the more you can kind of set up and develop what those expectations and that type of engagement should be, the more the audience will do that. And it's the thing that's changed a lot in the past 15 years. Most 80s, 90s movies, they kind of set up a thing, an ending, and you knew where the ending was going to be. These two people have to fight or whatever, and you spend the entire time establishing, this one guy's so evil, this one guy's so good, he's overcoming obstacles, it's all hard, until finally, by the time the ending came, you're really into it. But now they've kind of stopped. They don't think people can hold off on that payoff for 2 hours, and so they're trying to put that payoff into kind of every scene, which means it's sapped a lot of that overall power, because you can't get that type of anticipation for every single scene. And I think we've lost quite a bit with that kind of mentality. But it's also the reason I'm not a big fan of magic kind of in general, unless it's really well specified, because then just the magical character can do whatever they need to do to move the plot along at that given time, which means it takes me out. I don't get to kind of brainstorm along with them, because it'll just be whatever the author decides is convenient. I enjoy Death Note for that, because Death Note was obsessed with what can this little magical death book do? How can it kill people? And the fact that all the characters are kind of obsessed with all right, how much can we push the rules of this book meant that I don't know, I found that very, very fun. But let's talk about writer's block. There's the two different types. There's you have the fully blank canvas, and you have no idea what you want to draw on that. And if that's the case, just to lower the stakes for yourself. Just start drawing anything. Do I'm saying drawing, but it could be writing it. Just do something small. If you have no idea what you're doing, if you don't have that strong kind of passion core guiding you, don't be like, I'm going to make this giant trilogy or whatever. Do something that's attainable, because finishing the thing is going to amp you up to give you, the energy to do the next largest thing. So if you're stuck at that just blank canvas page, keep your goals small and just try to do the best small thing you can, where you get to be really proud of that and kind of show that to other people and be like, look, this is kind of what we're talking about. And you can show it to yourself. It's proof to yourself that you can do a thing. But if you know what the idea is, but you're writing and you just kind of get stuck at a certain point, again, like I was talking about earlier, I don't get frustrated at writer's block anymore because I just use it as a signal that I am not excited about where things are going. And so I start to just kind of walk around and be like, okay, well, one, can we show this from a different perspective? Two, am I just thinking about this fundamentally the wrong way? What if I just don't, all of these things I'm taking as a given that this one bit that I don't like has to happen? What if none of that happened? And that's been really liberating. And again, it means I'm usually going from the most obvious conflict that I was writing to something a little bit more unexpected that I found more engaging. So yeah, I don't know if this is for everybody, but just the idea that writer's block is literally just a signal that you should think about things differently is kind of actually useful. There's another thing. I love brainstorming with somebody. Like, I'll just be thinking of ideas for months and kind of slowly coming up with stuff, but sitting down and bouncing things off of somebody, and suddenly, like, all the ideas just kind of start coming. Even if they have no idea what I'm talking about half the time. Even if, like, it's just me talking to them, and then like suddenly I start kind of realizing. I mean, having a good collaborator who's really good at coming up with stuff is fun too. I've been brainstorming with Lux, and Lux is great at coming up with ideas. But even if they're not, just the process of articulating what you're trying to say to somebody makes a lot of things start to solidify in your brain and become obvious, and you have to start thinking through the ramifications. When you're on your own thinking about an idea, ideas are fuzzy, and you're normally just thinking about the bit in the middle, and it's hard to kind of picture the edges. Whereas once you articulate it, suddenly the edges of the idea are a lot more tangible, and that's where the brainstorming happens, at the edges of those ideas. If you don't have a person to collaborate with, the second best thing is to just start writing things down in a notebook. And a lot of times I think I have a lot of writer's block or I'm stuck on the brainstorm until I start writing what I do know. And just the process of doing that means I've realized the edges of the ideas and what I know, and it becomes really obvious what I don't know. And so I'll just kind of write the next thing, and that brings up the next thing and the next thing. And so much of stuff is about momentum. And so if I just start writing down something, even if it's like totally obvious, usually that's what jumpstarts me, making a whole mental map of like what's connected to what and how that works. But yeah, this is my sketchbook from recently, or I'll just kind of write a heading at the top, and I'll just start writing in all the details I know, and then it just kind of starts to... And I'll write anything on this page. It's not even... A lot of times what I'm writing is quotes about the thing, as if one character was explaining it. I'm trying to think about it in the context of how would you reveal this in a scene. So I'm kind of thinking like, ooh, would be a good quote or whatever. Or just little sketches, or like little, oh, what if I translate that into Latin, or kind of something like that. And what's crazy, I always vastly overestimate my ability to remember stuff. When I read through that, like I was reading through that earlier today, and I found an idea, a good idea, an idea I really want to use from 2 days ago that I wrote down that I had completely forgotten, and that idea would have totally just been gone forever if I hadn't reread it in the book. There's this thing the Beatles said where they'd be jamming, and the only songs they knew were worthwhile were the ones they remembered like the next day. No, you come up with great stuff all the time, and then your brain isn't good at being like, I should remember this forever, and so it's just gone. These things are great. Like, again, if you ever get stuck, just start reading back through all of your notes, because a lot of times it's like a bunch of ideas just from somebody who thinks the exact same as you, but you've forgotten even having the idea. It's great. And going back to the idea I was talking about of if you get stuck thinking, well, what if I just didn't do that thing? Honestly, the power of omission and skipping over stuff is one that I think, especially a lot of beginner writers undervalue, because they'll be like, and he woke up and he brushed his teeth and he got in his car or whatever, and just the fact that like the audiences are very sophisticated. You could just jump between locations and they totally are on board. And actually, the biggest tip for myself in this thing, because I always forget it, is can I make a scene non-verbal? I'll just have two characters. Again, it's the most obvious thing. It's two characters saying, I'm thinking this thing, I'm thinking this thing, let's do this. And it's like, all right, well, let's go to the next step. How can you express that visually through some other way that expresses that without it just being somebody blasting out the sound waves? And by forcing yourself to do it non-verbally, usually, one, if an actor isn't as good, nobody can notice. And two, it means the audience gets to be engaged because they're kind of able to piece it together with the characters too. And usually, yeah, it's just a more visual, dynamic, interesting kind of experience. It's one of the things I really enjoyed in Better Call Saul, where you just see these characters start to do all of these like insane random things, and you'd go, what are they trying to do? And then you get the payoff at the end of seeing their plan kind of come to fruition. But if they'd started that out with the two characters, which is how I would have written it, being like, oh, well, we should do this thing, so you do this and you do this and you do this, you don't need any of that. You can skip that, and then the audience gets to be kind of more engaged. And I guess I'm saying contradictory stuff, like, don't hold off on the big reveals, tell everybody everything right at the front, and also don't tell people things. But I think putting the big stuff, the big details at the front, so the audience can kind of like work with the anticipation, but also don't explain everything, so the audience gets to kind of be engaged figuring out how things go on a smaller scale. I think those two things kind of work together really well. And you can always try harder, and you can do that. You can do it very mechanically. If you have kind of a basic idea that you're thinking of, you can always pick like you can just ask more questions about anything in the scene that you're working on, or anything in the picture. Like if there's an object, who put that object there? Who maintains it? Who invented it? Why is it there? Are there other versions of that thing? What's the company that made it? And you can get as granular as you like. And obviously you can't go infinitely deep with everything in every single scene, but doing that for the major stuff in most scenes, I think really does kind of help put you into the headspace of the world and make sure you're making kind of more creative decisions. Same with characters, thinking, okay, what are they going to be doing right after the scene? What were they doing right before the scene? What did they do before that? The reason Salad Mug is actually so boring is because, like, that's not where the story was supposed to start. It was supposed to start with all this crazy, exciting stuff, but I kept thinking, okay, well, what happened right before that? What happened right before that? What happened? And eventually I got to the point where it's like, oh, this girl's bored and she's kind of making salads and she makes a phone call. That was kind of the most boring. And honestly, I still wanted to do all these different flashbacks because I developed it way further, before that. But I decided that would be a little bit ridiculous. But yeah, that's a great way to get over writer's block, is just putting the heading of some object or concept in the scene at the top of a page and just start writing as much as you can think of about it. And even if you don't use that stuff, it's nice to know it, and also that will help keep everything else lubricated and going, so that you don't get too stuck and frustrated, But also, like, fundamentally, art is taking stuff out of yourself. It's you taking the bits you've observed and kind of rethought about and transformed and turning them into a thing. And there's only so long, like art is this cyclical process. It's like kind of like breathing. You gotta take things in and you gotta take things out. You gotta take the stuff in so you can remix it in your head. And a lot of times I'm always trying to take stuff out, and then I'm like, why can't I, think or be excited about anything? It's like, I gotta find a new thing to be excited about. And you can do that. I've mentioned it on here before, but like, I'll just read a book that's got that's confusing and frustrating for me, but I'll write down every word I don't know, and I'll write down like maybe 50 different words, and then I'll go through and I'll just look up all of those words on Wikipedia, find out a bunch of new stuff, and usually one of those things will be a concept I'm really into, or I go, ooh, I'm gonna save that one, and suddenly like I've got this new bunch of inspiration. Or just, obviously movies, or books, or anything like that. If there's a movie that really speaks to you, sometimes I'll see a movie and I'll just like unabashedly be like, I want to explore in that zone a little bit. I want to like just kind of borrow that thing from that movie, and I'll like, even if it's like you like the way the rain is doing something, you go, I'm going to take that rain and have that rain landing on my world now. That's going to be fun. Or, even more obvious. The one thing I'd say is, especially for a lot of beginners, I think a lot of us learn by just emulating or trying to kind of recreate a thing that we saw that spoke to us a lot. But usually it's pretty obvious to the audience too, if that's what you're doing. And so if you want to bypass that, just rip off multiple things at once. Make your process like, what if I combined The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly and The Matrix into like this new thing? Because then at least like there's this artistic process that's happening. You are working as this fusion machine, and even if people are like, I can see exactly what they're referencing, it's still kind of cool, No, I ripped off so much stuff until I was like I still rip off stuff. I'm ripping off enough things at once now that it's not, no one element is too egregious. I have a lot of people that'll tag me and stuff being like, hey, this person's ripping you off. I'm like, that's great. Like, it's so fun to be a part of somebody else's kind of like creative process, honestly. And it doesn't hurt me at all. I just think it's fun. But yeah, movies are really good. Books are obviously, authors can be just so incredible, especially at understanding that macro and micro kind of thing. Like, authors, more than anybody I can think of, are good at that, like, finding those little moments that make life real and make life human, and recontextualizing them into their book. Certain books are just an absolute decadence of little observations they've made about the universe, and they get to give them to you. And like in doing that, you notice all of these new things now, and it's kind of changed you and the way you view the world. And I think that's so cool. Like it's, I think that's kind of the thing that makes a good director too. There's a lot of, it's interesting. I've been watching shows and movies that don't really do it for me recently, where I'm going, there's all of these good elements here. How do I say this? I've been watching things that kind of disappoint me, and usually I want to be like, okay, but why was this disappointing so I can avoid that? But when I look closer, instead all I see is a lot of people like obsessively working with love and pouring just a bunch of themselves and kind of like passion into it. I'm like, okay, but why, with all of this, why didn't it work? And I think a lot of it comes down to the director not focusing on those little moments that make things feel real, those little human bits or the little, you know, textural bits. Like it should feel a little bit elemental or a little bit. I want to be feeling something. In fact, that's the biggest role, I think, as a director, is you need to be the steward of the audience's experience. Like, it's so easy to be like, all right, we have to get all the characters together, we have to, in this location that we rented, and we have to make sure the lighting and all of that is all going, and getting so caught up in the logistics. But really, your only focus should be, what should the audience be experiencing as they watch the scene? And you want to make sure every single element is in service of that thought, of the audience and what they should be feeling as they watch it. And so that kind of mindset and goal usually to me translates to if a movie will be good or not, especially in terms of like remakes. Because when people get excited about a remake, whether it's, you know, a live action or just, you know, another updated version, is they want to feel the same thing that they felt that first time. And a lot of times what that means is they want to engage with those same sensibilities the creators had when they made the thing. And so when the people are doing the remake, they're thinking on, you know, they want to match all the different characters and the casting and the set design and all of that, but they're not thinking about those tiny little details that maybe the first like creator was really good at putting in there, and they're just looking at all of like the macro stuff, and so it doesn't feel the same at all. It's just really disappointing, and it's kind of hard to say why. I think the one thing people want from remakes is just exactly that vibe, and I think you can usually tell pretty well. Is like, did they get it? Did they not get it? But yeah, after books and movies and songs and stuff, ideally, your own life is one of the sources for inspiration. Obviously, if you're an environment artist, you already know this. Once you've been working on a scene, then you walk out into the world and you're like, oh, look at this. Here's a lot of details I can just borrow from real life. But it's the same thing with social interactions and all of that. Kind of trying to get out of your own head when you're interacting with somebody and kind of like seeing it from an outside perspective, or just, you know, people watching, being creepy and just taking notes on like different people's conversations. But it's an interesting exercise you can do literally at any time, is just sit in the moment you're in and be like, what are the things that make this feel like what I'm experiencing right now? Like, to the process of sitting in a room and hearing the computer fan kind of blowing and like the RGB lights kind of spinning. If I turned out all the lights sitting there and just like the computer is almost this campfire kind of like ambient phenomenon that's happening, and having a running computer be a presence in a scene like could be a thing. Or the idea of sitting in a traffic jam, like what does that mean? Like, we've all seen scenes where somebody's stuck in a traffic jam or whatever, but like how could you go that extra mile to really make it feel real to the audience, like they were trapped there too? One thing I love is the trudging through the desert under the blazing sun trying to get to water or whatever, because there's a million of those scenes in movies, and each one goes, you know, at a varying level of intensity. Like how much do they convey? I know it's really done it if I pause the movie and I get up and I'm like, I'm gonna go get some water. Oh, this water tastes so good. Oh, you don't have any water. Oh, this is great. Sadistic that way. Anyways, thanks for listening to me talk for, I don't know what this will edit down to, 5 minutes, half an hour, 45 minutes. Yeah, I've got some. I got to run down to LA for a week, but then I'm coming back, and ideally by then I'll be ready to release a couple episodes. So I'm very, very, very excited about that. I've got a bunch of tutorials. I'm making a list I want to make. Yeah. Anyways, I'll talk to you soon. Thanks for hanging out.